move forward, right? So the last two questions that we were left with, here's the question which says, use economic theory to explain why New Zealand specializes in dairy products, right? And exports of dairy products and meat, and imports of machinery and consumer goods, right? So the question is a pretty simple and straightforward question. It asks you why this country, New Zealand, is specializing in dairy products and meat and agricultural goods, as we say, and why the country is importing machinery and all that thing, right? So the answer lies in the idea. So you can start off by saying countries, uh, or you can say based on economic theory, right? So what's the idea? Countries specialize on the basis of absolute or uh, comparative advantage, right? Yes or no? Do we know that? Right? Exactly, absolutely. Based on economic theory, countries specialize on the basis of their absolute and comparative advantage, right? Now we can explain both, but I think obviously comparative advantage makes more sense over here, right? But you can only talk about comparative advantage as well. But just for the sake of to be on the safe side, I've written both absolute and comparative advantage. Then you can very quickly define what absolute advantage is. Absolute advantage says that a country should specialize in products which it can produce lower, which it can produce at lower cost, right? Yes or no, right? Or larger quantities. So what is absolute advantage? So absolute advantage is pretty simple and straightforward. It says that countries should specialize in products which they can produce with lower cost or in larger quantities, right? So that's the criteria for absolute advantage. On the other hand, comparative advantage refers to the idea that countries should specialize in products which they can produce with lower opportunity cost. Yes or no? Produce with lower opportunity cost. Okay, now the next thing is really important. As you know, the question is for 4 marks, so you can't just get complete 4 marks just by defining what comparative advantage is. You need to explain why you think New Zealand has comparative advantage in primary products, right? So you can't simply get 4 marks just by mentioning what comparative advantage is, right? And defining this term. You also need to explain why do you think that New Zealand has comparative advantage in primary products, right? Is this correct, right? So for that, what you say is that based on countries' factor endowments, or you can just write the word of the country because we are obviously talking about New Zealand, so we have to be specific. Based on New Zealand factor endowment, it can produce agricultural products, including dairy and meat, with lower opportunity cost, since its factors of production are more suited for production of agricultural rather than manufactured goods, right? So this is what you need to say, right? So the idea is fairly simple, Fizit, as we talked about in a couple of other instances as well, that when do countries have what products countries have comparative advantage in? So that depends on the fact that what type of resources you have, right? So if countries have, simple example would be, perhaps you can relate to Pakistan's example. So Pakistan is a large country with a lot of fertile land with a lot of large supply of labor, unskilled labor, which we normally require in agriculture and all that, right? So we are better suited, our resources are better suited towards production of agricultural goods. We don't have much technology, we don't have much finance to buy machinery, invest in machinery and all those things. Therefore, we can't have a lot of advantage in manufactured goods, which is evident from our exports. We do export some manufactured goods like textiles, football, like sports equipment and some other products, but still the major chunk of our exports is coming from our agricultural products. Why? Because our resources are more suited towards production of agricultural goods. Is this making sense? Right? So that's exactly the same reason with New Zealand, that since it has more, its resources are more suited towards production of agricultural goods, dairy products, and meat. Therefore, those are the products it specializes in, and it exports those products. And the remaining, which it's not very good at producing, those are the products that it will import. Now, we'll quickly move to the towards the marking scheme to see if we have answered it correctly or not, right? For identification of comparative advantage as the relevant theory, 1 mark. For recognition that New Zealand has lower opportunity cost in the production of the dairy products and meat, that's for 2 marks. Like that will get you a total of 2 marks. For recognition that New Zealand has higher opportunity cost in the production of machinery and consumer good, okay, that's just putting it the other way around. For linking the New Zealand's comparative advantage to resource endowment, right? Can you see that, right? So that's what you were supposed to say, right? So that's the idea. And you can also say, excuse me. So for such questions, you can also say that when countries specialize in products which they have comparative advantage, they can produce more output, which allows them to earn higher foreign exchange. Yes or no? Because what's the objective of any country? The objective of any country is to earn as much foreign exchange as much you can. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge is you have limited resources. Okay, fine, got it. Now, with those limited resources, you need to produce products that are best suited for your own factors of production. Yes or no, right? So you should dedicate your resources towards production of those products that you can produce more, and therefore that will help you to earn more foreign exchange, with which you can then buy imported goods which you need, right? Easy, correct? Okay, can we move on? Okay, then the last question here says, discuss whether rising deficit in New Zealand, right? So it says, discuss whether rising deficit in New Zealand's balance of trade is what would be expected given the change in terms of trade after June 2011, right? So for a question like this, we'll need to go back and look at the case study, right? So it says, the question basically, let's read it one more time. The rising deficit, so balance of trade deficit of New Zealand, is what would be expected. Discuss whether rising deficit in New Zealand balance of trade is what would be expected given the change in terms of trade after June 2011. So what has happened after June 2011? Let's talk about that, right? So let's read this. New Zealand's annual trade deficit has increased to $1.4 billion in October 2012, up from a deficit of $875 million in the previous year. The total value of exports in October 2012 was 11% lower than in October the previous year. This can partially be explained by 5.5% rise in exchange rate of the New Zealand dollar over the period, right? Dairy products accounted for nearly half of the decline, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Then what is happening to the country's terms of trade, right? Let's talk about this. Okay. New Zealand terms of trade declined 3.2% from June to September 2012. There was a 13% drop in dairy prices, which contributed to a 32% rise in volumes of the dairy products exported. The net effect on the total value of dairy products was an increase of 16%. Meat prices fell 6%, but the volumes were 11% higher, so that export receipts from the sector were 8.9% higher than June. Okay. Now, what's happening in June 2011? That's what we are that's what we are expected to tell. So have a look at this, right? So terms of trade is declining. Khizr, have a look at this. So this is June 2011. You can see that import prices are relatively stable. In fact, there was also a question that we answered in this regard. right? Describe the change in the New Zealand terms of trade from June 2011 to September 2012, right? And what we saw was that import prices were relatively stable, but there's a sharp decline in export prices. So if export prices are declining and your import prices are kind of steady, right? So what it would do overall to your terms of trade, that your terms of trade will deteriorate or decline, right? Or get worse. Now, with that happening, what effect would that do to your trade deficit? What effect would that do to your trade deficit? That's what you're expected to do. And since the question says discuss, so we do know that we have to talk about both sides of the argument. Do you agree with me? Right? Yes, it would increase, right? So yes, it would increase, like the trade deficit would increase. No, it instead of it, let me write the exact word. Trade deficit is what we're talking about. Trade deficit would increase. No, trade deficit would not increase, right? So these are the two things we are talking about. Okay, now let's get started here. Okay, perfect. Now, what reasons we have to believe that the trade deficit would increase? Now, think about this. When your export prices are less valuable, right, you have to see whether the price elasticity of demand for your goods is more elastic or less elastic. Now, listen to this very carefully. If your export prices are declining and your products have more elastic demand, which means when your products become cheaper, the increase in demand is more than proportionate. The increase in demand is more than proportionate, which is the case with what? Which is the case with dairy products, as clearly mentioned over here, right? It says that there was a 13% drop in dairy prices, which contributed to a 32% rise. So the rise in volume, the rise in quantity is 32%, which is greater than the decrease in price, which is 13%, right? And overall, the net value of dairy products export was increased by, it increased by 16%, right? So the volume is increasing and the export revenue is increasing. So that's a good thing, right? Because it's more elastic demand. Similarly, for the export prices, for the meat exports as well, you can see clearly the prices fell by 6%, but volumes were 15% higher. So the export receipts from the sector were 8.9% higher than June. So these are the two major exports of New Zealand. And when their prices drop, we saw that the quantity demanded increased more than proportionately, and therefore the total export revenue that you earned was higher. Is that correct? Right? So the first thing that you'll write is that the two major export items of New Zealand, dairy products, meat, have more elastic demand, right? Which then you will go on to explaining that, you know, when the demand is more elastic, any decrease in price results in more than proportionate increase in quantity demanded, therefore leading to higher revenue, correct? Okay, now we'll move forward, Khizr, and you know, we'll talk about if there is any other evidence that makes us believe that it will improve the trade deficit. Sorry. Sorry. I wrote it over here. It should not have been over here. It should have been over here, right? So the two major export items in New Zealand, namely dairy products and meat, have more elastic demand, which then you'll explain that it would overall result in higher export revenue, right? Okay, now moving on, let's see if there is some more evidence. Exports of transport equipment fell by 7.2% volume terms, which was likely to reflect reduced economic activity. The key markets for New Zealand manufactured exports, right? Demand in Australia is expected to recover. Interest rates, custom, you know, right, are showing signs of improvement, right? Okay. Then we have, right, New Zealand annual trade balance deficit increased from this to this. The value of exports was this. This can partially explained by the rise in the exchange rate, right? Okay, nearly half of the decline in exports, right. Okay, now what about Walaikum Assalam, Suhan, how are you? Okay, so Suhan, we are doing the last question of this previous case study that we started off, but we could not complete. That was May, June 2014, and that was about New Zealand, if you remember, right? So New Zealand trade performance and all that, right? So the question here says, have a look at this. The question says, discuss whether a rising deficit in New Zealand balance of trade is what would be expected given the change in the terms of trade after June 2011. So whether you would expect the New Zealand trade deficit to increase due to its deteriorating terms of trade, as we can clearly see that in June 2011, right? This is June, your index of export prices is significantly, this is export prices, you can see, right? So these are export prices, and you can see clearly export prices are declining significantly. Your import prices are kind of readily considerably stable, right? And that's why your overall terms of trade has deteriorated. Now, with a deterioration in your terms of trade, would your trade deficit increase, decrease? That's what you're expected to answer, right? Right, very good. Okay, so Zohan, so first of all, what we said, and this is what we got from the case study said that when your export prices fell, have a look at this. So there was a 13% drop in export prices, which contributed to a 32% rise in the volumes of dairy products, right? The net effect on the total value of dairy exports was an increase of 16%, right? So since these products are more elastic, so dairy products, and same goes for the meat, right? So meat and dairy products are two major exports of New Zealand, and when prices drop in the past, right, we do know that they have resulted in more than significant increase, more than proportionate increase in their quantity demanded, and therefore resulting in overall increase in revenue, right? So this argument goes in the no part. Why? Because no, the trade deficit will not increase. Why? Because you will get to export more quantity, and therefore you will get more export revenue, right? But then what about the products that you're importing? If you're importing, right? Sorry, if you're importing more inelastic goods, right? Trade deficit decrease, it would depend on the PED of exports. Absolutely correct. Right? Now, what about the goods that you're importing? So you can see clearly that your import prices didn't change much, didn't change, a slight decrease and so on, right? So if your import prices are relatively stable and the demand for your imports is inelastic, let's see if we have some evidence of that. Exports of transport equipment fell 7.2% volume terms, which was likely to reflect reduced economic activity in Australia and United States, the key market for New Zealand manufactured goods. Demand in Australia is expected to recover in 2013, aided by interest rate cuts and renewed economic activity in China. Furthermore, prices for many New Zealand key exports commodity, blah, blah, blah. Right? Okay. What else? Students, so if your import prices are kind of steady, right, and you are importing goods that have, inelastic demand, right? So prices for imports haven't changed a lot. And let's say if you are importing inelastic goods, right? So then your import expenditure would not increase significantly. I repeat myself, think about this, right? So in case import prices would have been rising, what would you expect, right? You would expect that, and given there is inelastic demand, import prices are rising. If let's say, and for imports, if a country has inelastic demand, then you have to import those products no matter what. Like think about Pakistan, what's happening with Pakistan right now. Oil prices are skyrocketing, and we can't afford to not import oil. I mean, it's a very basic thing used in industries and transportation and all that, and we have to import oil. So we are spending more money to import that, right? But that is the case where import prices are on the rise. Here, import prices are kind of steady. Yes or no? In fact, a slight decrease as well. So if you look at June, this is exactly June. So here somewhere was your import prices initially, and by the end of September 2012, your import prices slightly declined, right? And if you're importing inelastic goods, then is that a good thing for you or a bad thing for you? Is that a good thing for you? What do you think? Depends export prices of competitive countries. If they're less than New Zealand, then even if the terms of trade depreciate, it won't have much effect on the exports of New Zealand. Can you elaborate on this, Zohan? So you're saying that it depends on the countries that New Zealand is competing with, right? And give me an example. So if they are less than New Zealand, so if export prices of other countries less than New Zealand, even if terms of trade or New Zealand prices are less than, So if New Zealand prices are less than its competing countries, right, then New Zealand will continue to export more. I think that's what you are trying to say. That's correct. That's correct. Export prices are declining anyways. So export prices, one, for New Zealand are declining anyways, right? So that's what the question says. The question says, have a look at this. Discuss whether the rising deficit in New Zealand's balance of trade is what would be expected given the change in terms of trade after June, right? So after June, what's happening? June 2011, your export prices are declining, right? So with that, you have more elastic demand for your um, dairy products and meat. Therefore, that would get you more export revenue, right? Secondly, you would say, since import prices are also decreasing a bit, and if the demand for New Zealand imports, what are the products that New Zealand imports? And if the demand for New Zealand imports, namely machinery, I'll show you, it's mentioned in the passage, machinery and there was machinery is what New Zealand imports. It's mentioned over here. Right. Where was it? Right. It was in the question. Sorry, it's not mentioned in the passage. My bad. My bad. It's mentioned in the question, right? So the question before this that we did asked us to use economic theory to explain why New Zealand specializes in products, in exports of dairy products and meat, and imports of machinery and consumer goods, right? So we can take this as a hint that New Zealand is primarily importing machinery and consumer goods. Now, for the consumer goods, you tell me one by one. For consumer goods, would you expect the demand to be more elastic, less elastic? Students, quickly. Would you expect the demand for consumer goods? Let's first talk about consumer goods. So when consumer goods prices are declining, because we did saw from the graph that there's a slight decrease in import prices. So import prices are slightly declining and you are importing consumer products that could include cars, clothes, laptops, consumer home appliances, right? And all sorts of things. So would you expect the demand for consumer goods to be more elastic, less elastic? What do you think? What do you think, guys? Right? So you would expect the demand for consumer items to be more elastic, machinery and consumer goods. We do know that generally the demand for consumer goods is more elastic as these are luxury items, and therefore if import prices are declining, then we would expect New Zealand citizens to import more of consumer goods. Yes or no? Am I right with this or am I not? Citizens to import more of consumer goods, hence resulting in higher import expenditure. Yes or no? Right? So with higher import expenditure, what will it do? It will cause a trade deficit, right? So it will cause a trade deficit. Sorry, again, I'm writing it in the wrong part, right? So it should be over here. So this is where we say that yes, import expenditure could be higher because the demand for consumer goods is more elastic. Students, did you get this part or not? Please do let me know if this is confusing. Please ask me so that I can explain it, right? So all you have to do in this question, it's asking you just to make the link between terms of trade and trade deficit, right? Now, what is terms of trade? Terms of trade is broken down in two things: export prices and import prices. So export prices for New Zealand is falling. We know that for a fact. And import prices are also falling to some extent. Now, all you have to do in this question, you have to link export and import prices with the price elasticity of demand to determine whether the trade balance, where the balance of trade would be positive or negative, right? Easy. And what is trade balance? So trade balance doesn't look at the prices. It looks at it looks at the revenue. It looks at the revenue. Price into quantity is the revenue. That's what it looks into. Is it? Are you getting me? Is it? So prices, export prices and import prices in terms of trade, so prices are just one thing, but the balance of trade is not looking at the prices of the goods. It's looking at, it accounts for the revenue, export revenue and import expenditure, right? So that is where the price elasticity of demand comes into play, because prices will determine the change in demand, and then the change in demand would overall determine the change in revenue, right? And that would determine whether your trade balance will improve or deteriorate. Easy. We good on this? Okay, but what about machinery? But for machinery, we expect the demand to be less elastic. Yes or no? Because I mean, think about it. It's not a luxury item. You just need to import machinery based on how much you need in your country. Correct? Right? Sorry about that. I'm also not feeling very well today. Okay. So with machinery, the idea is that you only import based on how much you need in your country. Correct? Right? So for machinery, demand uh, is expected to be less elastic, therefore slight decrease in import prices, as we saw from the graph. Decrease in import prices is expected to reduce overall expenditure on imports. Yes or no? Right? Is that correct? Is that correct? Right? Okay. Now, students, let's try to summarize this, and then we'll add one or two more points to this question, right? Now, the question was saying simply to tell that when the country, New Zealand, is the country we are discussing here, when this country's terms of trade is deteriorating. And why is the terms of trade deteriorating? Because export prices are declining, right? What would happen to the balance of trade? What would happen to the balance of trade, right? So what we did, we analyzed separately both for exports and imports, that what happens when export and import prices fall, and in the light of price elasticity of demand. So since New Zealand exports are more elastic, so any decrease in prices for exports is a good thing for the country. Why? Because then overall it gets to export more quantity, and with more quantity it gets to earn more revenue, right? Which is a good thing. And therefore it means that you will not face trade deficit, right? Correct. However, for the imports, import prices are also slightly declining, not declining a lot. And then since consumer goods are more elastic generally, so that's a problem for the country, because when prices for consumer goods are declining, and they have more elastic demand, you would expect the citizens to import more. When they import more, the import expenditure would be higher, and therefore that would contribute to a deficit. However, for the machinery, the other item that New Zealand imports, machinery has relatively less elastic demand, so you just have to import as much as you need, not more, not less, right? So with the decline in import prices, right, so you would expect the expenditure on machinery to be slightly lower, and therefore that would improve your trade deficit. Correct? Won't be inelastic, as firms will not compromise producing goods. They will buy machinery no matter what the price is. That's what I said. That's what I said, Zohan. So the machinery is expected, but for machinery, demand is expected to be less elastic, right? You have to import no matter what. But why I'm saying import prices are declining, Zohan, you're not looking at it. I totally got your point. So you're absolutely right that machinery demand is less elastic. Therefore, the decrease in import prices, as you saw over here, right? So import prices are declining June 11. So if you see, it was slightly above 90 index points in June 11. It was slightly above 90 index point, and by September 2012 it hit the 90 benchmark, right? Yes or no? So there was a slight decline in import prices. So when it's an inelastic demand, you will just import a fixed quantity and prices are declining. So we would expect the overall import expenditure on machinery to be lower. Is that correct? Right. No problem. No problem. Happens. Okay. Now, the last thing that you have to tell students over here, that these are not the only terms of trade, is not the only factor that affects a country's terms of trade. There are other factors as well. Can you tell me what are other factors? Um, can you tell me, students, what are other factors that affects a country's balance of trade? In fact, it's also one is also mentioned in the case study here. Let me show you, right? So the question, the case study said that one reason for less exports for New Zealand was the fact that its exchange rate appreciated, and its exchange rate appreciated by 5.5%, right, against dollar over that period, right? So when you're exchange rate is becoming stronger, your goods become less competitive for foreigners, and therefore they will import less, correct? Right? And then obviously there are exports, and then how good your trading partners are doing, right? Other factors that affect countries' trade balance includes, right, changes in exchange rate, or simply exchange rate changes, right? Then quality and substitutes for your exports. So if there is a higher quality for your exports and less substitutes for your exports, like there are not many countries that export the products that you export. So that's a good thing for a country, right? Because that means that the demand for its, so on, right? Then another thing that is important, the economic activity with your trading partners. Yes or no? So if your trading partners are already doing well, they are, they are experiencing boom in their local economy, and they are, trading more, they are importing more, then obviously your country will get a chance to export more. And with that happening, you'll get to make more export revenue. Correct? Right? So that's another thing. Okay, now let's go to the marking scheme. Let's see what the marking scheme has to say about that, right? Okay. For explaining that a declining deficit or surplus might be expected given the impact of a declining terms of trade upon export and import prices. For explaining that a declining deficit or surplus might be expected given the impact of a declining terms of trade upon export prices and import prices. For analysis of the factor that may result in a rising deficit that actually occurred because J-curve elasticities, Marshall-Lerner condition, changing factors in export markets, right? So one thing that we skipped over here was J-curve. What does J-curve says, right? Do you guys know what J-curve is? So students, J-curve says that when your export prices are lower, right, and the demand for your exports is more elastic. So basically the concept that we explained is just the J-curve, right? But we did not name it, right? So what is J-curve? Students, have a look at this. So J-curve says that when your export prices are declining, and you have more elastic demand for exports, in fact, not only for exports, but also for imports. When your export prices are declining and you have more elastic demand for your exports and imports, right? So from a deficit, you move from a deficit to a surplus, right? So on the y-axis, you have surplus, right? On the negative side of the y-axis, you have deficit. On the x-axis of this graph, you have time, right? Now, what happens over here, that when initially your terms of trade or balance of payments is in deficit, and your country's export prices start declining, right, for any reason, then what happens slowly and gradually, if price elasticity of demand is more elastic. So if price elasticity of demand is more elastic, your countries that import from you, they start finding your products cheaper, and they import more from you. And with that happening, you get to export more quantity, which is happening exactly in this case with New Zealand, because you were, as clearly mentioned in the case study, that you were exporting more quantities for dairy products and meat, and therefore that would help you uh, export more in number, more export revenue. Correct, right? But did you notice, students, did you notice in this question that the question is not only talking about the terms of trade and its effect on balance of trade, it's also talking about other factors, right? Changing factors in market, export markets, right? Which we mentioned, that how well your trading partners are doing, and what's the quality of your exports, and how many substitutes are there for your products, and all those things, right? Because those directly impact your performance on trade. Correct? Any confusion, Khizr, Zohan? Time lag between people realizing, yeah, so there is some time lag, exactly, that's a very good point. So all of a sudden, it's not a straight upward sloping graph. Students, is it? Please remember that it's not that the moment, it's not that the very moment your that declines, right? Your export prices decline and your terms of trade starts to improve, move from a deficit to a surplus. No, it's not a straight upward sloping line. So for some time it's deteriorates, right? So from a deficit, the deficit increases up till this part, but then slowly and gradually when people realize that this country export prices are cheaper, so that's when they start switching to your products rather than your competitors' products, right? Is this correct? Right? Okay, so that's the thing, students. I'm glad we are making a huge progress. So for the remaining part of the class, we'll quickly read the case study for October, November 2014. We'll not do the questions today and we'll do the questions in tomorrow's class, but let's read the case study. United States hit again. China is a currency manipulator. United States hints again, China is a currency manipulator. Okay, so let's see what it has to say. The US Treasury regularly reviews the exchange rate policies of 9 economies that account for 70% of US foreign trade, with most of the focus on China, the world's second largest economy, right? So by 2030, I did tell you that China is expected to become the largest economy of the world, beating USA. USA is currently the largest economy. China is the second largest, but that's the prediction. So let's see how that goes. However, still, China and USA are the biggest trading partners. They trade a lot, right? And that is what the case study says, that US Treasury regularly reviews exchange rate policies of 9 economies. So 9 countries with which USA accounts for the largest trade, 70% of its trade, with most of focus on China, the world's second largest economy. The Treasury welcomed gains in the value of the Chinese yuan, but said the currency remains significantly undervalued, right? So even though the Chinese currency did appreciate a little bit, right, the Treasury welcomed gains in the value of Chinese yuan, but said the currency remains significantly undervalued. The undervaluation gives China, and this I might have mentioned before as well, right? In our discussions, in our classes and all that stuff, when we were talking about exchange rate, I did tell you that country like China get major benefits by keeping their currency value weaker, right? Because then it makes their products more competitive. So this is exactly what the USA is accusing China of doing, right? This undervaluation gives China a large advantage in its bilateral trade with the USA. However, the Treasury declined to accuse China of currency manipulation because it could lead to Chinese trade sanctions against the USA, right? The Treasury did not accuse China of currency manipulation. Why? Because then they were afraid that if they do so, and if USA imposes trade sanctions on China, then even that is not a very good thing to happen. Again, I mean, it's a very, very interesting thing to see that countries do get benefits. So in this case, if you think about it, USA is getting a benefit by importing cheaper goods from China. But if it constantly imports cheaper products from China, then China is the main China will be the one exporting more and not importing much. Yes or no? And that is exactly what happens every year. USA has a deficit in its trade balance with China, which means that every year China is exporting much more to USA compared to what USA is exporting to China. Are you getting what I'm saying about it? But obviously you can't really say that USA is not getting anything out of it. USA is getting, and that is that USA gets to import cheaper products. Correct? Is this making sense or not? Right. Could be jealous, but I mean, they also have a valid economic claim that, every year if they're making a deficit against China, they don't mind, they don't like that. And that could be one major reason for China outperforming USA very soon as the largest economy in the world, right? Correct? Because I mean, there's a limit to how much you can grow locally, right? Because to grow locally, that means all you are producing is selling locally and all that stuff. So for a country to for a country to grow significantly, it has to focus on export-led growth. As we say, what do we call it? Export-led growth. So in that case, a country is focusing on exporting more. When they do that, they get to produce more goods and services, which increases their GDP significantly, and that helps them grow. And that's what China is doing. The Treasury argued that Chinese authorities know that an appreciation appreciating currency is of overall benefit to China, and said the yuan has gained 9.3% against the US dollars between June 2010 and November 2012. It said that when inflation was taken into account, the value of Chinese currency had increased 12.6% since June 2010, when the Chinese authority agreed to allow the yuan to be bought and sold more freely on the foreign exchange market. The US Treasury said that the yuan's appreciation has been insufficient. Okay, now this is interesting. Let's read this one more time. The Treasury argued that Chinese authority know that an appreciating currency is of overall benefit to China. So they are making this claim that a stronger currency would benefit China. That's what US Treasury is saying. What US is saying, that Chinese authorities know that their stronger currency is a benefit to them. But and said that yuan has gained 9.3% against dollars between June 2012 and November 2012. It said that when inflation was taken into account, the value of Chinese yuan has increased 12.6% since June 2010, when the Chinese authority agreed. What did Chinese authority do? So Chinese are moving towards more free floating exchange rate. You guys know what free floating exchange rate is, right? So when you do not intervene in the markets and you let exchange rate value to be determined freely by the market forces of demand and supply, right? However, based on China's huge and rising stock of foreign exchange reserves, the US Treasury said that the yuan appreciation has been insufficient, right? So they're saying that given the amount of reserves that they have accumulated, because what happens when you are constantly exporting more, when you're constantly having a surplus, what happens? You earn foreign exchange reserves, and with constantly exporting more, what happens? Your exchange rate also appreciates. So US Treasury is saying that based on the gain in the foreign currency reserves, they were expecting the Chinese currency to have appreciated more, which is currently undervalued. Right? Are you getting me, right? So this is how US Treasury is estimating that the Chinese currency should have appreciated more, but they are still keeping it a little weak for the reasons that I've already explained to you. These rising reserves, together with other factors, suggest that real exchange rate of the yuan remains significantly undervalued, and the further appreciation of the yuan against the dollar and the major currencies is justified. So they are just saying that in the final comment, that still Chinese yuan, even though it appreciated, but it has not appreciated to the extent to which it should have, right? And that's the claim that USA Treasury is making against China. Right? Various economic indicators, China 2007 to 2013, inflation, how much was the inflation in 1995? It was the base year with 100 index point. Then how much was the rate of inflation in China from 2007 to 2013? 2013 is an asterisk. Asterisk means that it's a forecast. You can also see it over here. Current account balance, right? US $billion. Current account, you can just see amazing amount of surplus every year. 2007, it's a surplus. 2008 is a surplus. 2009, it's slightly decreased. 2010, it decreased even further. 2011, it decreased even further. 2012 decreased. And in 2013, it slightly increased, right? So exchange rate yuan per dollar, right? So how many yuan each dollar buys? How many yuan each dollar buys, right? So initially yuan was buying $7.61, then $6.95, then $6.83, and it's slightly appreciating. Which is appreciating? Yuan is appreciating, right? Because with each year, less yuans are being bought. So when each dollar is buying, because it says yuan per dollar, yuan, how many yuans is each dollar buying? So when each dollar is buying less yuans, so we know automatically that which currency is becoming stronger, yuan is becoming stronger and dollar is becoming weaker, right? So students, will stop here for today. We'll stop here for today, right? And then we'll continue from here in the next class, in tomorrow's class. And then we'll do the questions. It was an interesting case study, and let's see what questions we have regarding this case study, right? So I'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Have a good night. We'll have a class around either 9:15, 9:30, but I'll confirm you, right? Take care. Have a good night. Allah Hafiz.